Welcome to the deep dive. So today, our mission really is to boil down the essentials, the high-yield stuff on immunizing drugs.
Yeah, they're such a cornerstone of public health, aren't they? Super important.
Absolutely. And we're pulling this straight from Lilley's Canadian textbook, Chapter 51 specifically. We want to give you kind of an expert shortcut.
Right, a quick path to understanding the mechanisms, the different drug classes, and importantly, the critical nursing care that goes with immunity.
It all starts with the basics, how the body fights off invaders. We call those invaders antigens.
Yep, anything foreign that triggers a response. And that response involves making antibodies.
These specific protein molecules, immunoglobulins, that target the antigen.
And the focus for these immunizing drugs, well, it's primarily on the humoral immune system.
That's the part using B cells to make and release those antibodies we just mentioned.
Exactly. It's distinct from the cell-mediated system, with T cells and phagocytosis. But for vaccines and such, humoral is generally the main player we're leveraging.
Okay, so with that core idea, antigen meets humoral response. Let's look at the two main ways we actually achieve immunity, two different paths.
Two main strategies, yeah. First up is active immunization.
This is where your own body does the work, right?
Precisely. You get exposed to an antigen, maybe naturally or through a vaccine, and your immune system gears up. It creates this sort of cellular memory bank.
With specialized memory cells and plasma cells cranking out antibodies.
And the result, it's usually complete and pretty long-lasting immunity. It takes time, though, and relies on having a functioning immune system.
This can happen naturally, like if you survive the actual disease.
Or artificially, which is where we come in with things like vaccines or toxoids.
Good distinction. So toxoids.
Yeah.
Those are like detoxified bacterial toxins.
Exactly. They can't cause the disease anymore, but they're still highly antigenic. Think diphtheria, tetanus. They still trigger that immune memory.
And vaccines are suspensions of the actual microorganisms.
Right. They can be live, but weakened, attenuated, or killed, or even just parts of the germ, like subunits.
Okay, so that's active. What's the other path?
The other path is passive immunization. This is kind of the fast track.
How so?
Well, you basically skip the whole memory-making process. You administer serum or concentrated antibodies directly. Instant protection.
So the host gets ready-made protection.
Exactly. It happens naturally, like antibodies passing from parent to infant through the placenta or breast milk. That's temporary, though.
And artificially.
That's when we give things like anti-serum or immunoglobulin in a clinical setting. But again, the key thing here is that it's temporary.
Right, because your body didn't make those antibodies itself. The reticuloendothelial system just clears them out eventually.
Precisely. It only lasts until they're removed.
So if it's only temporary, why would we use passive immunity? What's the main advantage?
It's all about immediacy. It's absolutely critical when someone is immunocompromised and can't build their own active response effectively.
Or maybe they don't have time.
Exactly. Think about rapid, potentially fatal diseases like rabies or tetanus exposure. You need protection now. You can't wait weeks for an active response to build up. Passive immunity bridges that gap.
Makes sense. Immediate, but short-lived protection for urgent situations.
And, thinking about the community level, these two types of immunity connect to the idea of herd immunity.
Yes, where having enough people immunized protects even those who aren't.
Right. When a large chunk of the community is immune, the disease can't spread easily, which indirectly protects vulnerable individuals who couldn't get vaccinated or didn't mount a full response.
Okay, let's pivot then to the active immunizing drugs themselves, the vaccines and toxoids. Anything specific we need to know about how they're structured or named?
Yeah, a bit of terminology helps. You'll often hear vaccines described by their valency, like how many strains or types they cover.
So monovalent is 1, bivalent is 2.
Right. Trivalent for 3 strains and quadrivalent for 4 strains. You see that a lot with the flu vaccine, for instance.
And what about keeping immunity up over time?
That's where booster shots come in. Immunity can wane, antibody levels, what we call antibody titers, can drop.
The booster just bumps those levels back up.
Exactly. It restores the antibody titer to an effective protective level.
And I know there's a big push, especially with kids, to reduce the number of injections, combination vaccines.
Wow, absolutely. That's a major trend. Think of the pentavalent vaccine DTaP, IPV for polio, and Hib all in one shot.
Wow, 5 in 1.
And there's even a hexavalent version that adds hepatitis B to that same mix. Much easier on the kids and parents.
Let's talk about some specific ones. DTaP versus Tdap, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis.
Right. The main difference is age and the dose of the diphtheria component. DTaP is typically for the pediatric schedule.
And Tdap.
Tdap is for adolescents and adults. Crucially, it has a reduced amount of the diphtheria toxoid.
Why reduce it?
It's primarily to minimize the risk of local reactions, which can be more common or severe with the higher dose in older individuals who've likely had previous exposures.
Gotcha. Okay, what about Hib, Haemophilus influenza type B?
Oh, the Hive vaccine was a game changer. It drastically cut down cases of bacterial meningitis in young kids. Just plummeted.
Huge impact. Is it used in adults too?
Yes, but typically only in specific high-risk adults who weren't immunized as kids and have conditions like immune deficiencies or maybe lack a spleen.
Okay, hepatitis B vaccine. I know healthcare workers get it.
Yes, it's an inactivated vaccine made using recombinant DNA technology, which is pretty cool. Definitely indicated for high-risk groups like us healthcare providers.
But not just us, right?
No, the recommendations are broader now. It's routinely recommended for all children, naturally, but also specifically for all adults who have diabetes.
It's interesting. Why specifically adults with diabetes?
It relates to the increased risk of complications from infection and potentially impaired immune function in people with diabetes. So it's an added layer of protection for them beyond just occupational or lifestyle risks.
Good point. Okay, the flu shot, the yearly ritual.
Yes. The influenza vaccine needs updating every year because the circulating strains constantly change. Usually covers 3 or 4 strains, trivalent or quadrivalent.
And there are different types, injection versus nasal spray.
Yep. There's the standard inactivated influenza vaccine, the Love Peel, which is the shot. And then there's the live attenuated influenza vaccine, LAIV, like Flumist quadrivalent.
That's the nasal spray.
Right, sprayed up the nose. Generally, it's an option for healthy children and adolescents, typically ages 2 through 17.
Okay. Now, speaking of live attenuated vaccines, MMR comes to mind. Measles, mumps, rubella.
Yes, and because it's live attenuated, we have some really important contraindications to remember.
Like allergies.
Definitely. Anaphylactic reactions to vaccine components are a no-go. For MMR specifically, because the measles and mumps components are grown in chick embryo cells, a severe allergy to egg protein can be a contraindication. Also, allergy to neomycin, which is sometimes present in trace amounts.
And pregnancy.
Absolutely contraindicated. Because it's a live virus vaccine, there's a theoretical risk to the fetus. Women are advised to avoid pregnancy for at least 4 weeks after getting the MMR vaccine.
Okay, really critical points there. Before we switch gears to path of immunity, we absolutely have to talk about the HPV vaccine, Human Papillomavirus.
Yes. This one is remarkable. It is literally the first vaccine developed that is known to prevent cancer.
That's just incredible when you think about it. Preventing cervical cancer, anal cancer, some head and neck cancers.
It's a massive public health achievement. The version often used, Gardasil 9, protects against 9 different HPV types known to cause most of these cancers and genital warts.
We just get it.
The recommendation is pretty broad now, both males and females, starting ideally around age 9 to 12, but it's approved and recommended up to age 45. The key is getting it before potential exposure through sexual activity for the best protection.
Amazing stuff. Okay, that covers the big active ones. Let's move to the passive immunizing drugs, the instant temporary protectors.
Right. These fall into a few categories: antitoxins, immunoglobulins, and antivenins.
Antitoxins, like for tetanus.
Exactly. Something like tetanus immune globulin. It's purified anti-serum that neutralizes the tetanus toxin directly, providing short-term cover, say, after a dirty wound in someone not fully immunized.
And antivenins. That's
Yeah.
just like snake bites.
It often is. Antivenins or anti-serum against animal venom could be from spiders like the black widow or snakes like rattlesnakes, which are crotalids, often derived from immunized animals like horses, though newer ones might use recombinant tech.
Okay, and the immunoglobulins, those sound really specific.
They are very targeted. Take hepatitis B immunoglobulin or HBI. This is given for post-exposure prophylaxis.
Like after a needle stick.
That, or crucially, it's given to infants born to parents infected with Hep B, right away, usually within 12 hours of birth, alongside the first dose of the Hep B vaccine.
Double protection there. What about RhoGAM?
RhoGAM, or Rh0D, immunoglobulin. This is used for Rh-negative individuals who get exposed to Rh-positive blood.
Most commonly in pregnancy, right? To prevent the parent's immune system from attacking an Rh-positive fetus in future pregnancies.
Exactly that. It prevents sensitization.
And the last big one is rabies immunoglobulin.
Yes, crucial for post-exposure treatment after a potential rabies exposure, like an animal bite. It's given along with the rabies vaccine series.
But there's a very specific instruction for administering it, isn't there?
Extremely specific and critical. A portion of the rabies immunoglobulin dose must be infiltrated directly into and around the bite wound itself, if possible,
Right into the wounds. Why?
to neutralize the virus right at the site of entry as quickly as possible. The rest of the dose is then given intramuscularly, typically in the gluteal region.
And importantly,
Importantly, it must not be given in the same anatomical site as the rabies vaccine injection. Different locations are necessary.
wow, that detail really underscores the mechanism. Okay, this specificity leads us perfectly into clinical judgment and nursing considerations. Safety first.
Absolutely. Nurses play a huge role here. First off, knowing the contraindications, the absolute deal breaker.
What are the top ones?
Any history of a severe, immediate, or anaphylactic reaction to a previous dose of the vaccine or to any of its components. That could be yeast in the Hep B vaccine, latex in the vial stopper, gelatin. You have to check,
And live vaccines again?
right? Live attenuated vaccines are generally contraindicated in people who are significantly immunocompromised. Think cancer chemotherapy, high-dose steroids, untreated HIV. And as we said, pregnancy is usually a contraindication for live vaccines. Severe asthma can also be a contraindication for the live nasal flu vaccine.
What about if someone is just, sick with a fever?
Good question. Minor illness, like a cold without a significant fever, is usually not a reason to delay. But if someone has a moderate or severe febrile illness, it's generally prudent to defer vaccination until they've recovered. Postpone it.
Okay. What about adverse effects? What should patients and nurses watch for?
Thankfully, most reactions are minor and localized. Soreness, redness, maybe some swelling right at the injection site, sometimes a low-grade fever. These can usually be managed with warm compresses or acetaminophen if needed.
But there can be severe ones.
They are much rarer, but yes. We watch for high fever, say over 39.4 degrees Celsius, and there's a potential delayed reaction called serum sickness.
What does that look like?
It can involve things like edema, especially of the face and throat, a rash, joint pain or arthritis, and in very rare severe cases, even cardiovascular collapse. It's an immune complex reaction.
And if a severe reaction happens?
It must be reported. In Canada, that's through the Canadian Adverse Events Following Immunization Surveillance System, CAESSS. This tracking is vital for ongoing vaccine safety monitoring.
That safety data is so important, especially when dealing with public concerns. The chapter mentions the debunked link between vaccines and autism.
Yes, it's crucial to address that. That original study was retracted, declared fraudulent, and multiple large-scale studies since have found no link whatsoever between vaccines and autism. The scientific and medical consensus is clear.
But vaccine hesitancy is still a real issue.
It absolutely is. The text notes about 17% of Canadian parents report some hesitancy. So, as nurses, a key role is assessing attitudes non-judgmentally, listening to concerns, and providing clear, evidence-based information. Building trust is key.
What about drug interactions?
Big one is immunosuppressants. Things like corticosteroids, cancer chemotherapy, they can blunt the immune response to active immunizations, making the vaccine less effective.
So timing might be important there.
Yes, coordination is needed. Also, a practical point, giving IM injections requires caution in patients on anticoagulants like warfarin due to bleeding risk. Applying pressure after is important.
Okay, let's talk implementation, the actual giving of the vaccine. What's the absolute top safety priority?
Always, always, always have epinephrine 1.1000 readily available and check that expiration date, just in case of a rare anaphylactic reaction. And you need to monitor the patient for at least 15 minutes after the injection. Some protocols say longer for certain vaccines or patient histories.
And patient education is huge, too.
Massive. Reassure them they cannot get the actual disease from killed or attenuated vaccines. That's a common misconception. And really stress the importance of keeping accurate immunization records. Maybe even suggest taking a photo of the record. Double recording helps.
Good tip. Before we wrap up, the chapter touches on pandemic preparedness.
Yeah, it mentions the Canadian Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Plan, the CPIP. It's really a reminder that this whole field isn't static. Preparedness involves ongoing surveillance, planning, and coordination to minimize illness, death, and societal disruption when, not if, the next big one hits.
Okay, let's try to unpack this and summarize the key takeaways from our deep dive today.
Sounds good. I think the core distinction is between active and passive immunity. Active uses vaccines or toxoids to build long-term memory in the host.
Right, the body does the work, but it takes time.
Whereas passive immunity uses preformed antibodies for immediate but temporary protection, critical for specific situations.
And from a nursing standpoint,
The priority is always safety. Careful assessment for contraindications, especially allergies to things like yeast, eggs, latex, knowing which vaccines are live versus inactivated.
and being ready for adverse effects, both minor and the rare severe ones like anaphylaxis or serum sickness, reporting is key.
Plus, that crucial role of patient education, addressing concerns, explaining how vaccines work, stressing the importance of records and follow-up like booster shots.
Okay, so here's something to maybe leave our listeners thinking about. Drawing from this chapter, we've talked about these amazing triumphs, right? Smallpox gone, HPV vaccine preventing cancer. It's incredible.
Truly medical miracles.
So the chapter also implicitly points to this ongoing tension. We have these powerful tools, yet global health crises like new pandemics are predicted to happen again.
Yeah, the threat from emerging viruses like novel coronaviruses or new flu strains is real.
So the thought is, how does this field of pharmacology, the science behind these immunizing drugs, continue to adapt? How do we stay prepared for threats that are constantly evolving? It's a dynamic challenge, isn't it?
It really is. Constant vigilance and innovation are needed.
Well, that feels like a good place to pause for today. Thank you so much for walking us through that.
My pleasure. It's vital information.
And a huge thank you to you, our listeners, for joining us for this deep dive from the Last Minute Lecture team. We'll catch you next time.